think you have the capability to do that. Hello and welcome to the IFA's post-15th Global Conference on Aging Thematic Discussions Among Experts, the second of 4 webinars in the series. As a reminder, this webinar is recorded and live streamed on the IFA Facebook page. This webinar will begin with brief remarks from 2 expert speakers, which will be followed by a moderated discussion. Please use the Q&A question and answer function along the bottom of your screens in order to pose any questions or post your comments for today's speakers. Dr. Jane Barrett, IFA's Secretary General, will read them out to the speakers during the moderated discussion. Following the webinar, any relevant resources will be posted on the IFA website, and that link will be posted as well. And now it is my great pleasure to pass the floor to Dr. Jane Barrett.
And good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, one and all, and thank you, Andra, for this introduction. In recognition of the exceptional calibre of content presented at the IFA's 15th Global Conference on Ageing in November 2021 in Niagara Falls, the IFA is very proud to be collaborating with AARP to develop a webinar series to build upon the thematic series. I think it's important to also recognise the contribution of AARP to ageing issues globally as well as domestically. And AARP, as a member of the International Federation on Ageing, is one of the founders of our organisation. So we're very proud to collaborate, to partner, and to work with AARP on a number of different fields. COVID-19 and older people. Unpacking intersecting inequities affecting older women. That's the topic of today's webinar. The year 2020 marked the 25th anniversary of the Beijing Platform for Action. And some of you on the webinar today may have actually been in Beijing for this very momentous occasion. I know a past IFA President, Irene Hoskins, was certainly present at this meeting. This was intended to be groundbreaking for gender equity and equality. Instead, with the COVID-19 pandemic, even the limited gains made in the past decades are at risk of being rolled back. The pandemic has and continues to deepen pre-existing inequalities, exposing vulnerability in social, political, and economic systems, especially for older women. We have 2 outstanding speakers to set the scene for this important discussion today. And the first speaker, Papa Sek, Chief of Research and Data at UN Women. He leads the organisation's research and statistical work, including UN's Women's Women Count Global Gender Data Program, research and strengthening the production, dissemination, and the use of knowledge to enhance UN Women's competence as the global broker of knowledge on gender equality and women's empowerment. Since joining UN Women in 2009, Papa has co-authored several editions of UN Women's flagship reports and contributed to various other research projects. Prior to joining UN Women, Papa worked in UNDP's Human Development Report Office, co-authoring 3 global reports and a book on risk, vulnerability, and human development. It's a great honour for you to join with us today, Papa, so the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you very much, Jane, for this introduction. And it's really a pleasure and an honor for me to join you today to speak on this very important issue. And again, this is really, I think, a timely conversation to be had, and I'm really happy to be part of this webinar. And just I think for the time I have, I just wanted to share with you a little bit, I think, some of the work that we've been doing recently, particularly, as Jen mentioned, the pandemic is really, something that has set back gender equality in quite stark ways. And where in a lot of ways we've seen that older women have really, borne really, I think, a lion's share of these negative impacts. And one of the things that I think was clear for us, and from the get-go, as soon as the pandemic hit, was that we needed better data to start to understand a little bit better how the pandemic was, would affect women. And as part of this work, essentially, I mean, we've really emerged also, I think, as a global leader in the promotion and production of data to inform gender-sensitive responses to COVID-19. Since April of 2020, we've teamed up with quite a lot of national statistical offices, non-governmental, governmental and non-governmental entities, and international partners to roll out what we call rapid gender assessment surveys in more than 70 countries. And last year, for instance, we looked at an analysis of these surveys looking at violence against women and how it affected women of all ages. And we've also launched with UNDP COVID-19 and gender response tracker, looking at information on how countries' responses were integrating gender equality in their policy responses, such as on care, violence, and jobs. And so, but I think here I'll just focus a little bit more on the rapid gender assessment surveys. And I guess the question is, why does that have to do with older women? And the question is everything. So, as I mentioned, since April 2020, we've been really making a concerted effort to collect data on older women to really understand what is the socioeconomic impact of the pandemic on them, including, for instance, on violence against women. And as we conduct these rapid gender assessment surveys, we've seen that basically a lot of innovation was needed, particularly to solve some of the main challenges that we see in data collection today when it comes to older women. Generally, a lot of surveys, if you take, for instance, the demographic and health surveys, on which a lot of developing countries rely, stop at age 49 in most countries. So really, I think this really means that older women are rarely visible in data collection. And if they're not visible in data collection, it means that they won't be visible in policy making. So what you don't treasure, you don't measure, and what you don't measure, you don't address. So in terms of the rapid gender assessments that I mentioned, so we've conducted them in 70 countries, and the results were really confirmed essentially some of the suspicion that we had, that the pandemic has really amplified the challenges for older women 60 and above. We've seen, for instance, that their economic security has worsened. For instance, extreme poverty, we expect extreme poverty to increase by 38 million for women compared to 34 million. But the rapid gender assessment surveys have found that 61% of older women reported losing income as a result of the pandemic, and that compares to 53% of younger women 18 to 24. We've also seen, women 60 plus reporting more reduced paid working hours than women of other ages, and women and men of other ages and men of similar age. We've seen also, I think, through these rapid gender assessment surveys, an increased burden of unpaid care and domestic work. more than half of older women reported increased domestic work and childcare compared to women or even women of reproductive age. We've also seen in the surveys, really, I think, a lot of challenges related to meeting health needs. And the violence against women rapid gender assessment surveys, for instance, which we've conducted in 13 countries, found that nearly 40% of women reported increased mental and emotional stress. And this was true for 35% of older women who were who confirmed that their daily mobility out of the house for themselves was limited. So this is also, I think, again, clearly a constraint that adds for an added constraint for older women, and to in terms of connecting with their support systems, such as family and friends. And obviously, again, violence against women was a key challenge, I think, for women of all ages, old and young. And the results from the 13 surveys that I mentioned really confirm this. And finally, we've also seen that, despite all of these challenges, older women really had immense challenges accessing government relief. We've seen that, for instance, only 17% of older women received unemployment insurance, and compared to 30% of older men. And also only 12% of older women were receiving cash or in-kind relief as a result of the pandemic. So again, really, I think, lots of challenges that they face, and, but the data also, I think, helped us to be able to better advocate with governments, to say, what, if you're prioritizing resources, these are the areas that you should prioritize. And, older women are really on top of the queue when it comes to challenges that you should address. And in some of the countries, basically, we've seen, for instance, if I take the case of Maldives, where as a result of these rapid gender assessment surveys, the government has started putting together policy packages that actually, benefit women informal workers, including older women. So, through this data, we've really seen, I think, in some, in 12 countries, we've seen a little bit more willingness from governments to actually start addressing these challenges. I think there's still a lot to be done when it comes to the relief mechanisms for older women, but at least I think this was an encouraging set of developments. Now, just I think focusing on some of the lessons that we've learned. We've seen that basically, I think, getting data on older women is important, and it's critical, but it's also not quite challenging, and you have to really be intentional about it, right? So as you might have expected, it didn't come easy with these RGAs, and what we were doing was really making sure that we oversampled, for instance, elderly women. So we prioritized, for instance, some age quarters, and to make sure that we were getting really, I think, the kind of representation that is needed to be able to analyze the data by age. And also, remote survey respondents can easily drop out mid-surveys due to respondent burden. So we ensured that, the questionnaires were tailored to, and shortened to cover the most necessary set of questions. And this really ensured that there was a higher level of participation from older women. So going forward, this year we are planning another set of rapid gender assessment surveys as part of the Women Count program, which I lead. And this is definitely going to be, an important topic that we will continue to address as part of our drive to really make older women counted and visible during the pandemic. And working with national statistical offices, we will continue to ensure that data collection is not is not limited to particular age groups. But before closing, I think I'll just highlight one important point, which is that, you know, what we've seen is that in everything, representation is important. The work that we've been doing with countries at the country, particularly on, you know, ensuring strong national coordination mechanisms include different stakeholder groups, I think, you know, is really one way to ensure that we can start to have the needs and interests of all the women, all the people in general, to be represented. So issues related to, you know, data governance and representation, I think we need to really start to see all the people really to be represented in those groups where, you know, decisions on what is collected and how it is collected are made. And I think if we start to increase that engagement, that participation, if we start to ensure it, I think we will start to make a better headway, at least when it comes to the data, but also, you know, obviously in other areas of policy making. So, you know, as we go forward, you know, one thing that we will start to do is really at the country level to start to see, you know, what are the ways in which we can start to better increase the representation of all the people in the national coordination mechanisms and decision making for that we support. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Papasek. I do want to just ask you a couple of questions before I go on to our next speaker, Erica Dar. And I want to take us back to the comment that you made about, you know, in many countries, the data collection stops at 49. And I think that's a really important signal for each and every one of us to actually take on board. I mean, 49. And for many countries, you know, that's midlife. So my question to you is, what is your persuasive argument to member states to change, you know, the age cohorts and the data collection? You know, because we have civil society that wants to be champion. So what's this persuasive argument that we could use?
Yeah, so the age cutoff is specific to certain surveys, right? So if you take, for instance, labor force surveys, they do not have that age cutoff. You know, and you know, the one that I mentioned, for instance, demographic and health surveys, which do include that health that cutoff, and that cutoff is, you know, it's historical. So there's, I think, a lot of factors behind it. But one thing that I would say is that, you know, there are countries that, for instance, have removed that cutoff. So there's a lot of, in a lot of ways, I think it's also the, you know, the willingness from countries to do it. So South Africa is an example where, you know, the 49 age cutoff has been removed in the demographic and health surveys. And, you know, and here I think, you know, again, if the drive exists at the country level, there will be a solution. Right, and that was the case of South Africa. And but again, I think it goes back to what I said, where basically I think, you know, there are participation in the decision about what is collected and how it is collected. Who is sitting at that table when we talk about data collection, right? So, you know, who are those user groups? And really, I think that participation is important, but also understanding, you know, what works and what doesn't. So. Recently, you know, the last few years, for instance, we've had the Teachfield City Group that has been doing really excellent work on understanding a little bit more, you know, what are the tools that we can develop when it comes to data collection on aging and age disaggregated data. And I think, you know, the City Group, which works under the aegis of the UN Statistical Commission, really, I think, has some of those tools that can and will continue to develop some of those tools that can help us to, you know, help us on the technical side, because, you know, again, as I mentioned, it is not an easy feat to get representation or to get at least some of the age quotas that you need. But, you know, it is possible. And, you know, some of those tools are now being developed in that regard.
You know, it strikes me, you know, my opening remark was about, we are now 25 years post Beijing, and, it still is a challenge, to ensure that the data is collected on older women. Just one more question before I return to Erica. And it really is about, the example of the Maldives that you gave, which is an excellent example of, a governmental response in the development of packages. One area that we're very concerned with, as we move through the pandemic, and keeping in mind that there are many countries that still have less than 15% of people vaccinated against COVID, the austerity measures that governments will inevitably put in place. So I see Maldives as a case of good practice. So where can civil society find these good practices that will actually help in our advocacy? Is there a source that we can go to, Papa?
Yeah, so as I mentioned briefly, some work that we've done with UNDP on documenting governmental responses to the pandemic. And I will share the link in the chat very shortly. But it's the COVID-19 policy response tracker. And in fact, we do have we're just now preparing a report, the final report of the tracker, that will be out probably in June or so. But really, I think with this database, you can zoom in on each country to see what responses they've put together. As I mentioned, so it covers violence against women policies, care policies, and employment policies. And we've collected data on over 5,000 policy responses and really assessed each of them on how gender responsive they've been. I think that's already an important start, an important database to see exactly which government is doing what and which government is not doing what, and to make sure to use that for advocacy.
And look, thank you very much for that. And we would welcome sending that link out. And that also then provides the IFA with a wonderful foundation to build, the theme of older women at our next conference in 2023 in June. So we look forward to that. And thank you very much for being with us today. Stay there, because I'm just now going to turn to Erica Dar, Director of Global Alliances with AARP's Office of International Affairs. There's no truer saying than Erica and her leadership, within AARP, but the way that she connects and outreaches to civil society, and also using a multi-sectoral approach. Erica has expertise working with the United Nations, and boy, is that an understatement, advocating on issues of global ageing, including the human rights of older persons, and on the Sustainable Development Goals 2030 agenda. Erica manages the AARP Office of International Affairs in New York City, where she is responsible for relationships with international non-profit organisations, UN agencies, and organisations dealing with ageing, as well as eminent international visitors. She spent 18 years in the broadcast and financial services industry. She received her bachelor's degree with honours from Delhi University in India, master's degree in corporate political communication from Fairfield University in Connecticut, and a master's degree from the New York University Gallatin School of Individualized Study. Erica's thesis was on transnational caregiving, and it was published and picked up by the New York Times. It is a great pleasure for me to introduce my friend and colleague, Erica Dar. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane. I can't tell you how honoured I am to be here today. IFA has been, as you said in your opening remarks, but they were reversed. You talked about AARP, but I just have to say that under your leadership, Jane, the relationship between AARP and IFA has only gotten stronger as the years have gone by, and the work that the IFA has been doing on vaccines way before COVID, vaccines on older persons, the work you've been doing on vision, your leadership at the WHO, you and your team are truly to be commended. And you're right, given the success of the conference, these conversations that were raised at the conference need to continue. And I'm delighted to hear about older women being one of the thematics for the 2023 IFA Global Conference. So I just want to acknowledge, in preparation for this session, the contributions of my colleagues at AARP who work in the field of gender and work, Susan Weinstock, Laurie Travinsky, and my former colleague, Melissa Grober. The economic impacts of the pandemic have by some been referred to as a she-cession, due to the disproportionate effect on women around the world, particularly those 50 and older. Plus, we are witnessing a global phenomenon of rising inequities which existed pre-pandemic, and Jane, you raised this issue of inequities. And this is prevalent in the developed and developing world alike. Higher levels of inequity help fuel the virus, which also exacerbated ageism. The OECD cited rising inequities as a global trend, with the danger of prolonged inequity compounding over time. So, for example, women across the life course earn less, save less, have less access to financial services and products, and typically are more likely to have non-linear working lives, while at the same time living longer than men. This impacts women in older age with less access to social protection, less economic security, and forcing more women into poverty. So the cumulative effects starting at a young age, leading into older age because of the longevity factor of women outliving men. The World Economic Forum cites that in a mere 2 years since the pandemic began, the gender wealth gap has increased by a full generation. Some global data show that only 26.3% of working age women are covered by a pension, compared with 38.7% of men. In lower middle income countries, the gender gap is greater, with only 8.1% of women covered by such schemes, compared to 20.8% of men. In the United States, this is data that AARP have been collecting, women comprised the majority of the workforce before the pandemic. 2019 labor force participation for women averaged 76% for women between the age group of 25 to 54, and 60% for women 55 to 64. However, in 2020, women lost 4.2 million net jobs in the United States and account for more than half of the net overall job loss. Industries with the majority of female employees were hit first and hardest. And we've seen that on television and in the news and places where we live, in retail, restaurants, healthcare, caregiving, state and local government. Now, for those women who managed to hold on to their jobs, many were in jobs which had no health insurance, no paid sick leave, hardly made a living wage, which leaves them or left them in a precarious financial situation. In a survey conducted by AARP entitled Women, Work and the Road to Resilience, Working Women at Midlife and Beyond, a survey of women 40 to 65 showed 41% lost job-based income and 14% actually lost their jobs. Now, women in communities of color have been hit particularly hard. African-American women were 20% of the population who lost their jobs, Hispanic 23%, Asian American 14%, and white women 13%. The ripple effect of their job loss is an increase in credit card debt, in taking money out from their retirement accounts, borrowing from friends and families. 25% of women said their financial situation had worsened, and it will take 1 to 5 years to recover. Not to mention that many of these homes are single family homes, single parent homes, especially single women who are caring for children and grandchildren. So we're looking at the multi-generational effects of these families who are affected by poverty are now going to continue down that path as they themselves age. In the decade of healthy aging, we addressed the issues of ageism as one of the pillars and within the framework of health. So on this note, I just wanted to address the issue of healthcare, the healthcare workforce. Data analyzed from 32 countries, constituting about 52% of the world's population and reported in the Lancet Commission on Women and Health, show that women contribute around US $3 trillion to healthcare annually, half of which is unpaid care work or work in fields, in agriculture or in trade. Now, this is a field where women are doing the work, but guess what? The men are the leaders or have those positions of power in the healthcare industry, and that needs to change. In the words of Claudia Mahler, who's our independent expert on the rights of older persons, structural ageism combined with sexism makes older women invisible. When you add in intersectional factors such as race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, gender identity, religion, national or social origin or status, these exacerbate the risk of gender inequality and discrimination in later life. During the pandemic, we saw the shocking abuse meted out to residents in nursing homes. Since older women are more likely than older men to be living alone and receiving long-term care, they outnumber men in nursing homes and were the victims of this kind of discriminatory behavior. So I'm just going to end now because I want to hear more from Papa, actually, and to see what questions come in from our audience, with some of the solutions offered by our CEO, Joanne Jenkins. When she talks about inequity, she says, as we look to the future beyond COVID, one area of focus for us is to build equity into the recovery in terms of health, wealth, and aging. We need to address long-standing areas of disparities and redouble our efforts in combating racism and ageism. Just to note, Aarp, during when the pandemic hit and we were all in lockdown and working from home, Aarp created a diversity, equity, and inclusion team. And they are working diligently to have age included in DEI programs in all organizations in the United States and globally. One other thing to mention, I've been focused on the US, but I do want to mention globally, and Jane, you talked about Beijing. I want to talk about CEDAW, the Convention on the Elimination on Discrimination Against Women. Now, we have 186 member states that have ratified CEDAW. But we don't have a convention on the rights of older persons. And this results in gaps in rights protections of older women as a distinct group. What we need member states to be doing, Jane, as you've asked us to think about solutions and next steps, is in their reporting on CEDAW, it must be imperative that their reports include older women. There is a lot to cover when we talk about this issue. As Papa talked about data, he talked about violence. We have, you know, the whole issue of technology and digital and access and literacy and retraining. We've seen in the US, the women that have been let go, the 50 plus, they're not being rehired, they're not being reskilled, and they're just not, you know, they're not getting jobs. So I'll leave it at that and happy to talk more. Thank you for the opportunity.
And thank you, Erica, and also to acknowledge the work of AARP in this particular field, and also, you know, Dr. Deborah Whitman. I think it's really important to come back to those strong voices that have been both domestic and globally, and AARP is certainly one of those voices. I wanted to touch on resilience. And you mentioned that AARP has a report that talks about the resilience, but it's quite rare that we talk about older women and resilience, isn't it? Could you just make just a comment, and it doesn't have to be an organisational comment, but, you know, while we're talking about, you know, contributions, we know in many humanitarian situations, the resilience of older men and women comes to the fore. So do you have any sort of personal comment about that?
You know, Jane, I'm really glad that you brought up this issue of resilience. I mean, you know, Human Rights Watch did a study of older persons in conflict. So they did a report. ARB helped fund that report. When you look at pictures coming out of Ukraine, and you see what's happening with older women or persons with disabilities, yeah, and the resilience that they will say to their families, go and make a better life for yourself, get out of here, we will be fine, right? I think, to be honest, when it comes to older women, women don't talk about themselves in that way. They just do, right? Women never talk about, oh, I'm a caregiver, as a family caregiver. They just think of them that this is their role. If you look around the world, you know, that's how women are. I mean, it's in the DNA, I would say, to just, you know, get on with it. Does that answer your question from a personal lens?
It certainly does, because I think what both you and Papa Sek has presented is some of the immense challenges that older women experience. And we do have some data about it, but it's about how can we move to a place where we have effective policy. Right. And, you know, we constantly see the images, and we saw it in Katrina as well. You know, Katrina was another example of older men and older women coming to the fore. And with the feminisation of ageing, you have, you know, proportionally, you know, more older women. So it's really about what is the narrative, you know, which is a real challenge. And Papa Sek, I wanted to ask you a question on behalf of Cynthia Stewart. Are you with us? I hope you are. Otherwise, I'm going to give it to, that's good, Papa Sek. I was going to give it to Erica. You've just been saved. Papa, Cynthia Stewart, Dr. Cynthia Stewart, IFA's main rep at the United Nations in New York, but also chair of the NGO Committee on Ageing in New York. Given the lifelong inequities for older women, how do you see overcoming them moving forward, such as digital literacy and access. And the caveat to that really is that not all the world is connected, are they? And so how are we going to really overcome some of these, fundamental challenges in your mind?
Yeah, no, and I think, this really speaks to the whole issue of inequality and the fact that basically it is layered, right? So, when we talk about intersecting inequalities, that's really, I think, what we are talking about. The fact that essentially you do have inequality when it comes to just connectivity in general, right? So, which is really, I think, a significant challenge that countries are trying to deal with, right? So, a lack of connectivity in this day and age is really, I think, the source of pretty much all inequalities, right? So at least a very big contributing factor given the importance of technology in development in general. And I think, what we see is basically, I think, increased investments to try to bridge the digital gap. And if it is not an issue that countries had woken up to before COVID-19, I think COVID-19 has really, put a spotlight on digital inequality. And I think, as that will require basically, I think, these increased investments in infrastructure that will allow, for better connectivity. And I think that's one issue. But, you've mentioned also, I think, older women, but it's not just older women. It's race, it's gender, it's location, etc. So these are all intersecting inequalities that need to be dealt with. But I think talking about, I think the whole issue of digital inequality when it comes to digital gap when it comes to aging, I think there are two factors here. One is obviously having access to the infrastructure itself, right? But the other one is really being able to use that infrastructure. If you have a phone, a smartphone, you should be able to use it. I think this points to the issue of, really connecting it with, I would say, education, literacy. The fact that basically, I think in order to learn a new skill, you have to have the belief that you can do it. I think it's that aspect of empowerment that we really need to start building into the projects, and projects that, do work on digital literacy, build digital literacy, digital connectivity, and so on. I think, again, as I mentioned earlier, with the data, you have to be intentional about it. With the programs and projects, you have to be intentional about it, right? So it can't just be a one size fits all. You have to find out what are the challenges that all the people are facing when it comes to connectivity, and really devising solutions that are designed to actually solve those problems.
Look, thank you very much. You start off, this word layering is so very important in this conversation, isn't it? Because certain layers will differ from population to population. Older women are not a heterogeneous group, and sorry, they're not a homogeneous group, they're a heterogeneous group. So this layering effect that really also makes it so challenging in the development of policy, because, we not only have the life course, but we also have this, the social determinants of health that will impact. And then you've got the economic impact. I think two phrases: being intentional. And I think when we're talking about rights-based policies, the intentionality is sometimes missing. So we have a more general discussion. And I think also the belief that you can do it. And I think across generations, women and growing into older women may not have that fundamental confidence and belief that they can learn new skills or do something or make a contribution. I think that, so there's something really about, the social structure, and the influence of generations that we need to tackle. I do want to go back and talk about representation. and it's a question to both of you. Papa Sek, you talked about the fundamental need for older people to be represented and engaged in the development of data sets, data research, being at the table. And you also mentioned data governance. So I want you to touch on, what do you mean by data governance? And then Erica, how do we reach out to those older women who are actually invisible, but we need them at the table? Because, the likes of me sitting at a table is not going to cut it, because I don't have the same challenges that someone in Thailand would have. So, Papa Sek, data governance.
Yeah. So, I think if you just take it, I think at its most basic level, at the country level, you have some form of data governance, right? So because you do have the the National Statistical Council usually that governs the production of data. There are laws that actually say what should be produced, who should be produced, who should produce it, and so on. So there are laws that govern data production and use, same as council and etc. that are created. And I think one of the problems that we have basically at that level is really as I mentioned, representation, but also what is in that law, right? Does the law does the law basically have a provision that the National Statistical Office has to collect data on older people, right? Does it have a law? Is there anything on representation of different stakeholder groups in national statistical councils? When we talk about data governance, we're not only talking about the national statistical offices anymore, or national statistical systems. We're really talking, I think, about a broader data group that includes, whether it's civil society, private sector, and so on, because data is, something that has become so important in the fundamental functioning of countries and societies. And, I think one thing that here we've been talking about, and if you look at, for instance, the World Bank's recent World Development Report, it makes a very strong case about the importance of data governance. I think, but one thing that hasn't been really featured in the report so much is really the issue of who is part of that governance, right? So how do we ensure that there's enough diversity and enough voices that data governance is equitable, is representative of the population that it is meant to serve? So it's really, I think, again, these are questions that will fundamentally decide what is collected, how it is collected, and who basically, how that data is used for, whether it's for policies, programs, or advocacy or research.
That's a really important conversation, because I come back to the UN Open-Ended Working Group in the 12th session, and, there were some movements towards, development of a core group. But I can't help thinking that, some of our advocacy really needs to be at the level of the national statistical offices and the system, rather than just talking about what we need. We actually need to actually focus on, how we get representation at a country level in some of these systems. So I think it's a worthy conversation to keep unpacking and learning from a civil society perspective. Now, Erica, I come to you because we talk about older women who are marginalized, isolated. We talk about, diversity, equity, inclusion. How do we actually get the right people at the right tables rather than the likes of me being at the table and I'm not the right person? So.
No, I disagree about that, Jane. But anyway, you asked me the question. So I will tell you, I have been, because of this virtual world we're in, I've been attending a lot of gender meetings, all right? And as you know, the UN in its work is very focused. And when I listen to all these gender meetings, and I ask the question about whether it be whatever the topic is, I listen very closely to hear what are they going to say about older women. I never hear anything. I raise the question, and guess what? They will take the question. They will answer the question, and I'm talking about several meetings. If it were a one-off, that would be different. But these are several meetings, and I will get a response of older women. Yes, that is a very important issue. We really need to talk about the fact that older women are actually not made visible. So in the conversation, whether it be SDGs of leave no one behind, we must be inclusive of older women. And I will tell you personally, Jane, I am waiting for the 10th or I don't know which will be the one where I will just basically explode and say, why does this always have to be an afterthought? Why does it have to be, oh yes, thank you very much for raising older women's issues. Why can't you think about it and talk about it up front? Why aren't you doing the work about it? And why do you then say, oh, this is very important, we should work on it? So that is my number one beef and my strategy in talking to those organizations working on gender to make older women a priority in their work, or at least include them if you're not going to make them a priority. And I think the other thing I was going to just talk to about, how do you, when Papa was talking about digital literacy, for us at Aarp, we work on this issue very, very closely at the national level and also on the international level. At the national level, Aarp has been advocating in every state to get broadband access, especially in the communities of color. So that is something from a policy standpoint. And then from international, we're working with the UN Secretary General's Special Envoy on Tech on the network of networks for digital cooperation, as this is an area very close to the SG's mandate and the work he wants to do. And we're going to be doing work around broadband, access, literacy, and universal design. So I just wanted to raise that.
Look, and thank you very much for both your comments and responses. I'm just going to now leave you for just a minute because I'm going to come back to you after I introduce our next webinar, to ask you for what is the takeaway message for our community today. So just bear with me. So on the 26th of April, it's going to be our great pleasure in partnership with AARP to be talking about the theme primary and long-term care, and the title is Prioritising Prevention to Maintain Cognitive Health in Later Life. So we'll have expert speakers from AARP and internationally to talk about this topic. So today we came together and Papa Sec started off by talking about the importance of this timely conversation and all the work that UN Women has been doing, across the last couple of years, and particularly touched on the rapid gender assessment surveys. And from a civil society perspective, we need to know more about those surveys. The depth and breadth of those surveys is going to give us some unique insights into not only the issues of older women, but some good practices, and one that was identified was in the Maldives. He talked about, the many challenges and the inequities that really were very stark in terms of access to relief and meeting health needs. There are many lessons that we need to be learning, and they've been really exposed, across the pandemic. I was struck by the conversation from Pampasek about, intentionality and oversampling and tailoring surveys. And he highlighted that the importance of representation, strong national coordination mechanisms and governance. And historically, talking about how, there has been limited attention to older women. And it struck me then that we're stuck with, historically, an age dependency ratio that makes no sense at all, in our contemporary life. So we then were delighted to hear some of the work of Aarp through Erica Dahr's presentation, talking about gender wealth, the gaps increasing, across generations, ageism, the healthcare workforce, structural ageism, and the words of Joanne Jenkins to build equity, health, wealth, and ageism. They're the areas that they're going to be working on. The importance of, the unit at Aarp that's been looking at diversity, equity, and inclusion. And she wrapped up by taking us back to CEDAW, the 186 member states that have ratified CEDAW, and still, we look at gaps in rights protection. And so we would be calling on, reports that include older women. And of course, the old issue that becomes more vibrant and more urgent as we grow older, and that is around violence. So I'm going to come back now to Pampasek and to Erica for their closing remarks. And before I do that, I want to thank the IFA staff, Andra Stanku, and also Rashmi Gupta that have supported the development of webinar, and of course, Aarp, without whom we wouldn't be doing these webinars and IFA wouldn't be in existence. So thank you to Aarp. So Pampasek, you're the first off the rank to give us our takeaway messages.
Yeah, no, thank you very much, Jane. And, thank you to you for the excellent moderation as well. So I think, in parting, I would just say that, of course, the challenges that we have, at least in my area of work, which is data, are not simple, right? So they're not trivial challenges. But I think, again, just reflecting back on a few years ago, I think, again, we are progressing. And I think it's just understanding how do we bring, those different pieces together. So I mentioned the work of the Teachfield City Group, which again is really, I think, quite fundamental, and trying to make sure that we bring these communities together. I think there are several different communities that are working, but probably not together, I mean, separately. And I think if we start to bring our forces together, we will really be able to achieve, what I mentioned there. So basically, I think that representation, so that collective voice, and again, it is through that collective action that we will be able to have the representation that is needed, and to start to make the progress that we need in order to advance faster. But again, I'm an eternal optimist, so I think we will get there. Thank you.
I'm a glass half full person too. So working together is key. So the last comment and thoughts from Erica Dahr.
I just want to say thank you, Jane, to you and your team. And I also want to say a special thank you to Pampasek. Pampasek is the one individual who has done this because of his personal passion. He has driven this work at UN Women. Where we have come today with the data collection is all thanks to Papa. And I have great faith in you, Papa, that UN Women will take this on, that they will address this at CSW next year, that older women will be a part of their programming, of your programming at UN Women, and we stand with you and here to support you in that work. I guess my takeaway message is, Jane, for our audience, to just ensure that you don't let up when you're in any meeting that you're in, whether it be a UN meeting or a women's group meeting, to keep your ear to the ground and see what they're saying and whether they do in fact raise issues of older women, and if not, why not, and make sure they do. So that's it, and that, you know, we work together as a team. That's the best we can do.
So thank you very much. And Papa Sec, I think that you've just been passed the baton to lead us, all right? So I'm not sure whether that's a good or bad thing, but you've got it, okay? So it's about working together and stickability. Don't let up. So Papa Sec, you have our support. We are aligned with your voice and your leadership. So we look forward to continuing our work with you and your colleagues going forward. Thank you very much to one and all. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.